Hello and welcome to the third chapter of my inquiry into the nature and causes of metoo. This is that other channel I don't want my boss to know about. My name is David Bors and I want to remain anonymous. Chapter 3 of Differences and Consent. At peak metoo, there was a brief moment where some people and activists were trying to make a case that whether we're talking about catcalling, unwanted attention at the workplace, sexual exchange for favors, full-blown rape, or the almost ritualistic abuse of minors in certain circles are all part of the same kind of abuse and are thus to be judged on equal ground. Abuse is abuse is abuse. That, of course, is ridiculous. And before anybody says that I can't judge these things because as a man I haven't experienced the daily reality of sexual misconduct, I can assure you that in my younger years I've received my fair share of unwanted attention from gay men, which was direct and at times aggressive to a degree that I doubt any heterosexual man could and should get away with behavior like this these days. As stated before, I've also been catcalled by gay men when passing the gay pride on my way home from work. And yes, I've even had James David Christie and others from his circle say inappropriate things to me. Now, does that make me a Me Too victim? No. It's been unpleasant, but I'm a big boy and I can deal with it emotionally. That despite the fact that I'm not necessarily a fan of what I believe to be a society that, by always striving for more liberation, creates the feeding ground for this kind of behavior to flourish. Let's not forget that many of the alleged perpetrators in the Me Too scandal were openly supporting and sometimes even financing liberal politics or politicians. Yet it's been quite often those people in my own surroundings that celebrate the rights of gays to express themselves uninhibitedly that would also fight most vehemently for their right not to be catcalled. So there's definitely some double standards going on. You can't have it all, but people usually just ask for separate things at separate times and tend to avoid putting things into relation with each other. You can't support the sexual revolution and all the things that could and would be derived from it, but at the same time be protective of your own right not to receive unwanted attention. Most alleged perpetrators in this scandal have been men, but not exclusively so. Just recently it was publicized that Asia Argento, one of the first women to accuse Harvey Weinstein of sexual misconduct, has apparently sexually abused a 17-year-old in 2006. As with all cases, also here the assumption innocent until proven guilty should reign supreme, but it seems that it's a rather obvious case, as it's been publicized and not disputed that she paid a considerable sum to the victim in question to buy his silence. The back and forth between both parties is, as always, closer to mudslinging than a real discussion, but it is quite interesting to see that the way the accusations and defenses play out is quite similar to the situation between Argento and Weinstein, just with the roles reversed. The alleged perpetrators almost always defend themselves by claiming things were consensual, at times even painting themselves as being on the receiving end of attention. This can also be seen quite clearly in the case of Andy Signore of Screen Junkies, who was also fired from his company after allegations of sexual misconduct transpired. Just recently, he and his lawyer released a statement in which they take the fight back to their company, accusing them of a company culture that was dripping with sexual misconduct, saying that it was common practice there. He also claims to be able to prove that at least one of the sexual relations in question was actually consensual and that the victim in question would first sleep with him, go out on a date with a colleague and sleep with him the same day, thus painting her in a less than favorable light. As with the original accusations, also here we have to say that people are innocent until proven guilty. But since this is a first defense, it does put things into perspective once you've heard both sides of the story, which we always should, regardless of our sympathies. Regardless of what all comes from this, especially the case of Asia Argento reminds me of the old saying about the revolution devouring all its children. And there's more than just one parallel to this saying. First of all, the Me Too movement does claim to be a revolutionary movement, supported by raised fists and claims that time's up. And as we discussed already, more often than not, it does transport a political message as well. And I also can't help being reminded of the cleansing that took place after the French or Russian revolutions, where the revolutionaries of yesterday became the traitors of tomorrow. A cycle that repeated multiple times until in both cases there was only one strong person left to lead the country, for better or worse. The fact that many of the alleged perpetrators were actively supporting progressive politics and feminist initiatives until they fell from grace is only the first step of this. Now we are reaching the point where the victims from last year are turning out to be predators themselves, and it begs the question where this cycle will stop. It also begs the question, what the hell is seemingly going on in certain circles? The amount of hypocrisy necessary to preach social progress on one hand, only to entangle yourself in a never-ending web of everybody hooking up with each other for favors, only to sue the hell out of them a year later, is mind-boggling. Frankly, I can't help myself but feel as if these people must ultimately be terribly bored with their lives, to constantly cross those lines to generate some sort of excitement, as nothing else they do apparently gives them this satisfaction. Argento's case opens another speculative can of worms as well. It's been rather well documented that former victims of abuse are more likely to become abusive themselves. So did she only sleep with the minor because she herself was abused by Harvey Weinstein? If so, what happens if, just purely for speculative reasons, it turns out that Harvey Weinstein himself was abused at an earlier stage in his life? Would that absolve him, at least partially, from his crimes, or at least explain them? This is, by the way, a good example that shows how important it is to discriminate between the different levels of misconduct and abuse, or else we'd end up boiling it all down to the same thing, which means we could be pardoning sexual abuse because somebody was catcalled at an earlier stage in life, since abuse is abuse is abuse, as seen before. Again, it's a slippery slope, and you'd be naive to believe that these ideas are purely of hypothetical nature, since in recent years society has already exhibited that exact tendency on a multitude of levels. And people are feeling that certain societal developments are spiraling out of control because once you progress past a certain point, you can't, by your own progressive logic, stop progressing further. Before I talk about the environments in which those abuse situations between adults mostly arose, I want to touch upon the principle of consent, which is actually a good example of progress spiraling out of control on one hand, while it's been neglected for a vast period of time on the other. Funnily enough, whether it's too lax ideas about sexual consent as we've experienced from at least the 1960s onwards, or whether it's the extreme backlash now, where young men almost need to get a written form signed before they have intercourse with a woman. Both extremes were driven by progressive, liberals, left-wingers. The picture that emerges is that of a society that was shaped by conservative norms, values and morals prior to liberation in the 1960s that got rid of a lot of those inhibitions. Certain rules were still in place, but too often neglected, either because people thought those rules, like celibacy, might disappear soon, because people silently opposed those rules anyway, or because of fear of being singled out as a prude. Now, what sounds maybe like a bit far-fetched might actually not be far off the truth. If we read the article from the Boston Globe, it describes quite clearly how a student was singled out for being prudish and asked to experiment more. I can say with good conscience that I've experienced a very similar attitude in those circles in which I've gotten to know James David Christie. And so again, it seems only plausible that he, who quite obviously indulged in this atmosphere in those circles, would have such an attitude towards his students as well. Granted, in those examples, there's usually a power relation going on, which I think lies actually at the foundation of the problem. When progressives, or liberals, however you want to call them, promoted their agenda in the 1960s, they actually weren't in a position of power yet, but they certainly knew how to enforce their agendas quite aggressively, thus creating a situation of pressure, which is quite typical behavior for revolutionaries. That is also my perhaps biggest critique of the establishment of that period, that they didn't draw a line and let themselves be bullied into submission, probably from the naive perspective that it wouldn't do too much harm. At this point, I should also add that I'm obviously not claiming that no forms of sexual abuse existed before the 1960s. Depending on the environment, they always have and probably always will. The inclusion of women in the workforce has certainly changed the playing field, leading to the work floor becoming another potential area to be sexualized. My argument, however, is still that the sexual revolution of the 1960s, paralleled by the rise of female workers in the workforce, did contribute to a less inhibited atmosphere. One only needs to watch some TV or movie excerpts from that time to get an idea of this. Also, this was not purely a male fantasy come true. It appears quite clearly that women of that era also enjoyed their newly found freedom quite a bit. I'm therefore pretty convinced that the time following the sexual revolution did lead to a rise of those cases and to a normalization of relationships that were neither bound by traditional wedlock nor clearly unasked for, such as rape. Critics of this idea, or rather defenders of liberalism, often encounter this with a statement that these things happened just as much before as they happen now. It's just that people didn't dare to speak about it. And while I'm willing to admit that this might account for a small part of the difference, it does not explain why we do have a larger number of testimonies and accounts about atrocities from the Second World War, but to my knowledge, very few accounts of sexual misconduct are documented before 1950, whether from the field of metoo or with regards to church abuse, at least not on a massive scale as today. If there are still Holocaust survivors around to tell us about the atrocities of the Nazis, why is there nobody around to tell us about the rape culture in the 1940s or 50s? If this was as widespread back then as it is now, then at least now that Me Too became such a global phenomenon, people should dare to speak up, if only to prove the alleged point that things were just as bad before the sexual revolution as after. Let's go back to the universities of the post-68 era. It is not completely unrealistic to assume that a silent agreement between faculty, students, and administrations became common, in which inappropriate relations became socially accepted, even if there were still rules against them. At the same time, those few that actually opposed the ideas of sexual liberation were peer-pressured into going along, which is exactly the situation that we see described in the article of the Boston Globe, and which is also the exact experience that I made while spending time in those circles. Some years ago, you'd be labeled as a boring outsider. Nowadays, you might even be called a homophobe or suspected of even worse if you don't openly approve of such behavior. So, after the so-called progressives got rid of the old dusty morals and norms of the old times, universities, workplaces, and other institutions became a playground for these unleashed sexual liberties, which ultimately led to access such as has been revealed over the past 10 to 20 years. So now it is the supposedly most liberal outliers of society, like universities, the arts, but also countries as a whole, like Sweden, that want to regulate all these things again. The formerly progressives are seemingly trying to correct their mistakes, but not quite, because they aren't exactly turning back the clock, but rather replacing the old rules, norms and morals that they had gotten rid of in the 1960s with their own new rules, which in practice might ultimately lead to a generation of young people unwilling and unable to engage in any relations between the sexes, simply out of fear for potentially being publicly shamed for it later and their careers and lives being subsequently destroyed. While the old rules were often rooted in century-old traditions, religion, and common sense, these new rules want to reshape humans into something they've never really been. They tend to regulate every little aspect so that almost all individual responsibility is abolished. Rather than educating people to develop a sense of responsibility for their own choices and actions, a tight corset of rules is created in which people might experience freedom, but only within the strictest of boundaries. It's essentially a playpen for adults. Going back to the question of consent, The rules of universities are quite clear about this matter, and while I'm not a fan of many of those new regulations, the sexual misconduct policy of Oberlin College, for instance, where James David Christie was teaching, is quite clear and well formulated in the header. What is sexual misconduct? There is a subheader, Power Dynamics within the college, which reads as follows. Faculty and staff members are prohibited from engaging in sexual relationships with students to whom they are not married or in formal domestic partnerships, even when both parties believe the conduct is consensual, because of the potential negative impact on individuals as well as the college learning and working community. This prohibition reflects an understanding that power inequalities due to role differences between faculty and staff and students affect the possibilities of effective consent. This statement makes a couple of important distinctions. Firstly, that there is qualitative difference between being married or in a formal domestic partnership or whether you're just having loose sexual relations. Secondly, the negative effect such sexual relations can have not only on individuals but the college learning and working community is stressed. And thirdly, it is stated that power inequalities affect the possibilities of effective consent. So with that being said, there can be no doubt that any teacher who engages in sexual relations with a student is acting in violation of those rules. And I would say rightfully so. If we are to appeal to emotions, we might come up with the one scenario where true love was prohibited from flourishing because it was forbidden love. That, however, doesn't take into account a couple of solutions that might be unpopular, but still workable if that love is so true that its call must be answered. One solution, without compromising the outcome of the studies, would be to just wait until graduation and get into a relation afterwards. Even if we assume that people fall in love on day one of their undergraduate studies, that would still mean a wooing time of a maximum of 4 years. Yes, that might sound really long and nearly impossible in this day and age. Which doesn't mean, actually, that the people involved couldn't forge a bond during that time already. They just can't engage in a sexual relationship. In practice, however, it seems that the sexual part of those relationships seems to be one of the primary, if not the primary, interest in the whole relationship. Another solution would be to just get into a formal domestic partnership or to actually get married before engaging in a sexual relationship. Which, of course, is also terribly old-fashioned, and it would be outrageous to demand that people to commit to their oh-so-true love before they ever got sexually involved with each other. So even if we take that one case of true love into account, the non-adherence to this rule seems to be primarily motivated by the perceived inconvenience it causes. But most importantly, it is a question of which risk we want to run as a society. From the 60s onwards, limiting someone's sexual freedom was a terrible offense. Not in a legal sense, but morally. And in many cases, obviously, people would have rather risked a situation where a whole curriculum might suffer from it than telling a teacher and a student that what they're doing is inappropriate. So now that we've established that teachers engaging in sexual relationships with students are clearly out of line, let's take a look at the tricky part. The students, and in extension also some of the metoo victims outside of universities. The female student that has been accused by James David Christie for being prudish and having to experiment more continues in her statement that sex was one of his favorite subjects. If I wanted to be a part of Jim's circle, I had to play along. This too is something I've witnessed on several occasions, and in fact I believe that this very dynamic extends way beyond the cases of sexual misconduct. Subscribing to a mentality, a mindset, a philosophy, a political viewpoint, and whatever else one can think of that distinguishes us from them is one of the most common parts of so-called networking these days. And in the circle of Jim Christie, whether the one he built at his universities or the one where I met him on his overseas travels, that unifying factor was sexuality. While that female student wasn't exactly on the list of potential sexual targets for James David Christie, she too had to make a choice, as all of us had to make when confronted with such a situation. Now, it isn't an easy choice because of what's at stake, and neither of us can look into the future to see how things turn out. It's not a choice anybody signs up for either, as it puts us on the spot in a moment where we're usually not really prepared to make this choice. But we can't expect universities to shelter us from real life until we are done with it, because it would make academic graduates possibly even less able to survive in the normal world, as is the case already now. In fact, all those attempts to create safe spaces at universities are completely counterproductive, because it creates an environment that breeds people that will only be able to exist in exactly this environment, which is ultimately what these people will strive to do. The choice we have to make is whether we play along, despite our better judgment, or whether we take a stand and walk out or file a complaint or whatever. On paper, that's an easy choice. It's much harder when you're at a stage where, after years of being pampered as a local, regional, or even national talent, you start getting a glimpse of the big music world, and you realize that you might end up not only not making the career of your dreams, but actually being completely unable to earn a living doing what you're doing. I will actually make another video on the career expectations, hopes and prospects of musicians at a later stage, as this is a topic that I've been studying quite intensively recently. In any case, for a young music student, being put in a situation where you can either be welcomed to the major league or being sorted out to be left struggling for the rest of your life is a huge choice. And unless people have a stable backup plan to make them independent from this choice, they are more than tempted to go along with this sort of network. One must imagine the situation when one of the people you might have been looking up to all your life turns out to be not only different than you had expected, but who also quite blatantly confronts you with the realities of what it means to be in the circle. Rejecting to play this game because you recognize the wickedness inherent in the system can be completely disheartening and an almost traumatic experience. Let's not forget that people in their early 20s studying music have usually dedicated already large portions of their childhood to learning an instrument to such a degree that they'd even be accepted into conservatory or university. All that is at stake when this choice has to be made. Colleges, universities and conservatories should generally take up a lot more responsibility when it comes to educating people for the realities they're going to face, rather than just leaving it up to the teachers and their preferences to decide what it takes to make it in today's music world. But that, too, is a topic that would feature prominently in the video about the career perspectives of musicians. If you are interested, watch this space, as this video is definitely one that will come soon. Back on topic. All those excuses made, however, students still do have a choice. From what I recall, none of the students was physically forced to do sexual deeds, and while I don't want to downplay the power and effect of psychological force, their shame lies not only in what has been done to them, but because of the choice they made. Because just as in the case of Harvey Weinstein's casting couch, the pact with the devil is always sprinkled with sugar. There are always promises of careers to be made, great futures to be had, or even simpler situations like going to that reasonably famous actor's apartment on your first date, such as in the case of Aziz Ansari. Did you really think he was only going to show you his stamp collection? At that point, it must be clear for everybody facing this choice that it's not a matter of talent that led them there, but also that talent alone might never bring them to a comparable point again. And while most of us know what the morally correct answer would be, few of us choose to walk that path. Walking the path of least resistance is always easier, and in some cases it might even get you some concerts or a job later on. I too have not really walked away from these opportunities. I haven't engaged in sexual relations with anybody to further my career, and I also never had to make a choice like this, thank God. But I've also kept a forced smile going in a discussion that has left appropriate territory a long time ago, only because I knew that if I stayed for a bit longer, I might benefit later. And make no mistake, it is very clear when you're in a situation like that, when suddenly you realize, I've stumbled upon a circle and they might be willing to accept me in it. Now I might be more conscious about this than others, but when on a consciously formulated level, or whether it's completely subconscious, I'm completely sure that everybody who ends up in a situation feels instinctively, on a very primal level, what is going on that at that moment in time, and makes his or her choices accordingly. And as a matter of fact, not only have I not walked away from such situations, I don't think I've seen a single person walk away from this situation. And I've seen a fair share of students and professionals from different walks of life be confronted with these choices. Apologies if actually I forgot the case in which it happened. I'm sure there are people like that out there as well. So, in case of doubt, greed, and opportunism for our own careers almost always wins it over doing the right thing. So much about the moral compass of artists and musicians. One thing, however, is for sure, it does get easier to avoid these traps when you become older and more settled. Having a steady stream of income and work can do wonders to our resilience against these things. So if our society really wants to battle metoo scenarios, then maybe it would be a good idea to create a job market in which people doing the right thing aren't punished for it, but where doing the right thing is rewarded with other opportunities. And it doesn't even have to be easy opportunities, no. But people should be able to see some perspective other than becoming part of one or more dubious circles. The real question is, who should be taking responsibility for such an alternative? The state? Not a fan, as the state, in my humble opinion, often is the biggest and worst circle of them all. Ultimately, whether it's private persons, companies, or the state, it all boils down to personal responsibility of making the right choice. By doing so, we generate more room for others to follow the same path. Comparing these dynamics in an organ class with those that work on a casting couch in Hollywood, we'd be foolish to expect them to be much different. And neither is the dynamic between a singer and the conductor that just invited her for a private rehearsal to his dressing room. Is there a power dynamic? You bet there is. Is it fair for the singer to be put involuntarily in this situation? Not really. Did she make the right choice to walk in there? No, definitely not. This isn't supposed to be victim blaming, even if it might sound harsh, but only because there are rules that say consent isn't possible in certain situations because of power dynamics doesn't mean that the victims of sexual misconduct are sheepishly naive when walking into these situations. From what has transpired from Asia Argento's affair with the 17-year-old, it certainly doesn't seem like he was raped against his will. There are still rules according to which it is wrong and forbidden, but does that make him a traumatized victim? I'm not buying it, sorry. In the case of James David Christie, one of the former students accusing him of sexual misconduct has been in a long-term relationship with his former teacher, which he admits himself. While it might have been his first homosexual experience, he since has become an openly gay man, which at least seems to hint at the fact that Jim Christie didn't just rape any man he came across, but that those that he had intimate relationships with were batting for the same team as he did. Relationships between older men and younger boys aren't at all unusual in the gay community and are often even explained and almost blessed by referring to this exact kind of constellation dating back into ancient Greece. Except for their sexual relation, the older gay man fulfills the role of a mentor to the younger man, and by the look of it, one could assume that the relationship James David Christie had with his preferred student of his, going as far as promising him his job after he retires, was exactly of this nature. While I can't say anything conclusive about this, I've been told by a person who knows both of them that this was exactly the impression the outside world had of this relation, and the student certainly did benefit career-wise from this liaison. In this light, it becomes difficult to see the student simply in the role of a helpless victim, considering all the benefits he's enjoyed over the years while being in a prolonged relationship with said teacher. Let's not forget that even if we're talking about an age gap of 20 years or more, and about a power dynamic that all those students are adults with supposedly bright minds. Looking at things again on a bigger scale, I would argue the same does apply to people who sit down on the casting couch, because they know, or at least should know, what they're in for. People have been making jokes about Harvey Weinstein for a long time, even publicly, and given the sexually loaded atmosphere in Hollywood, these things couldn't have come really as a surprise unless you're an airhead that just came off the bus and immediately stumbled into Weinstein's hotel room. I should stress once more at this point that I'm in no way defending this system, or that I'm saying that the alleged perpetrators were right to do what they did. But I'm deeply convinced that when we are talking about this situation, that we aren't dealing with a black and white situation, but that there are many shades of grey to be considered. In fact, I'd prefer if things were more clear-cut. But that, again, becomes a political matter, and I'm not sure that the agendas evolving now to legislate these issues are the best way to deal with this problem. While we want the state to protect us, we should also want the state to interfere with our lives as little as possible. Calls for personal responsibility are often dismissed as either victim blaming or even racism, but I'm convinced that it is only personal responsibility that can help us get a grip on these things, while still maintaining our freedom. If we feel disgust at the notion that we even have to think about the fact whether there was at least a hint of consent in some of those relations, then it is because deep inside we want the world to work according to higher laws than such primal relations, even though we might know it not to be true. Unfortunately, if we rid ourselves of restraining cultural laws that keep these instincts in check, while at the same time living in an environment where there's a scarcity of work allowing you to make a living, the result is exactly this kind of primal selection process. And when we then try to evaluate the problem by politicizing it as an example of toxic masculinity, patriarchy, and possibly even white privilege, then we are reducing it to a political agenda and missing out on the bigger picture behind it, which lies on a deeper level. We need to take a critical step back, look inside ourselves, and ask whether we really know how we'd like to shape the society we're living in, and whether we are aware of all the consequences that come with these decisions, or whether we're just happy to join in whenever there is easy outrage that allows us to comfort ourselves. That we are, after all, fighting the good fight. This is it for Chapter 3. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in Chapter 4, where I talk about the environments in which sexual misconduct happens and which regulations might or might not work. Oh, and that's also the chapter where I quote Jordan Peterson. So whatever side you're on, don't miss that one.